The first ships arrived on a Tuesday. Nobody remembered that detail later, not because it was unimportant, but because everything that came after made the day of the week feel like a joke. A Tuesday. Like the universe had a sense of humor, got the Vorkai did not announce themselves. They did not send a signal, did not hail Earth's communication satellites, did not slow down as a gesture of peace. Their fleet came in from behind Jupiter, using the gas giant's shadow as cover. And by the time humanity's deep space detection arrays caught the heat signatures, the ships were already past the orbit of Mars. 17 vessels, each one the size of a small moon, moving with the quiet confidence of something that had done this 1,000 times before, because they had. The Vorkai were ancient in the way that made human civilizations look like sand castles at low tide. They had been traveling between stars before Earth's dinosaurs took their first breath. They had burned worlds, harvested moons, stripped atmospheres for fuel, and moved on without a second glance. They were not cruel. That was the part that haunted the xenolinguists who would later study their communications. The Vorkai were not evil. They were simply efficient. Humanity was a resource. Earth was a staging ground. The math was clean. Their first action was not an attack. It was a message. One of their smaller vessels, smaller being relative, since it was still 3 kilometers long, descended into the upper atmosphere above the Amazon rainforest and released a compound that the Vorkai used for rapid terrain modification. Within 6 hours, 40,000 square kilometers of the Amazon were gone. Not burned, exactly. The compound did something worse. It dissolved organic matter at the cellular level, leaving behind a flat gray plain of sterile minerals, perfect for construction. The trees, the animals, the rivers, the birds, all of it turned to gray dust that drifted on the wind for weeks afterward. The message that followed came in every human language simultaneously. Translated by systems the Vorkai had been running since they first intercepted Earth's radio signals 200 years ago. The message was short. It said, "This is what we do to things that are in our way. You are in our way. We will return in 30 of your days to begin full operations. You may leave. You cannot stop us." Then the fleet moved to a holding position beyond the moon and waited. The United Earth Emergency Council met for 11 hours straight. There were generals who wanted to launch everything humanity had immediately. There were diplomats who wanted to negotiate. There were scientists who ran the numbers on Vorkai ship mass and energy output, and then quietly left the room to be sick in the hallway. The consensus that emerged from those 11 hours was grim. Humanity's most powerful weapons, every nuclear warhead, every orbital platform, every experimental directed energy system, would inflict cosmetic damage at best on ships of that size and that technology level. It would be like throwing gravel at a freight train. But there was a third group in that room. They were not generals, and they were not diplomats. They were a mixed team of military strategists, xenobiologists, materials engineers, and one very quiet woman named Dr. Siramwanji, who had spent 15 years studying how humans had always fought against things that were bigger and stronger than them. She had studied guerrilla warfare, asymmetric conflict, insurgency, resistance movements from every era of human history. She had a theory, and in the chaos of that meeting, she stood up and said it plainly. She said, "They burned the forest because they thought it would break us. They don't understand what fire does to humans. Fire doesn't break us. It's where we learn to think." Nobody laughed. A few people stared. Then one of the generals, an old woman named Admiral Chung Yulan, who had spent 40 years in conflict zones, looked at Sira and said, "Talk." What Sira explained over the next 3 hours changed everything. The Vorkai model of conquest was based on a simple assumption that held true for every species they had ever encountered. When a civilization faced an overwhelmingly superior force, it either fled or surrendered. The Vorkai had encountered over 60 intelligent species across their centuries of expansion. Some ran, some submitted. A handful fought briefly and were crushed. None had ever done what Sira was proposing. None had ever looked at a smoldering ruin and said, "Good. Now we have nothing left to lose. Now we fight on our terms." The Amazon was gone. That was real, and it was a grief that sat in every human chest like a stone. But what the Vorkai had done, without knowing it, was remove a vast stretch of terrain that humans were afraid to damage in a war. They had turned it into a battlefield humans were now free to use without hesitation. They had created a kill zone and handed it to the defenders. Sira pulled up maps. The gray plains left behind by the Vorkai compound were flat, featureless, with no electromagnetic interference. Perfect for human tunnel networks. Perfect for concealed emplacements. Perfect for the kind of layered underground infrastructure that Vorkai sensors, designed to detect life signs and organic matter, would completely miss, because there was no organic matter left to serve as background noise. They were going to fight in the ashes, and they were going to make the ashes into a trap. A 30-day window was not wasted. While the world's media ran continuous coverage of the gray plains and the drifting dust clouds, while political leaders made speeches and people in cities held vigils for the lost forest, something else was happening underground. Literally, the largest coordinated construction effort in human history began within 48 hours of the Vorkai message. It was not announced. It was not broadcast. 7 nations contributed engineering cores. Mining companies handed over their deepest boring equipment. Military tunneling units that had been classified for decades were activated and deployed. By day 10, there were 300 kilometers of tunnel running beneath the gray plains. By day 20, there were over 1,000. The tunnels were not just passages. They were weapon systems, storage facilities, command nodes, medical stations, and ambush corridors. They were lined with materials specifically chosen to be invisible to the sensor profiles that Sira's team had reverse engineered from the Vorkai's own approach trajectory. On day 28, Sira stood at the edge of the gray plain in the early morning and looked out across the flat, dead ground. The dust had mostly settled by then. The sun rose orange through a sky that still carried particles of what had been the greatest rainforest on Earth. She did not cry, though she had cried before, in private, for what was gone. Now she felt something colder and cleaner than grief. She felt ready. Behind her, a junior officer named Lieutenant Deo Okafor approached with a tablet full of status reports. He was 24 years old and had volunteered for the ground team 3 weeks ago. He looked out at the plain beside her and said quietly that it was strange how the Vorkai had made the whole area so flat. Like they'd done the prep work for them. Sira almost smiled. She said yes. That was exactly right. They had Dayo looked at her and asked if she really thought it would work. He wasn't challenging her. He genuinely wanted to know. He had family in Lagos, parents, and a younger sister, and he had the look of someone trying to hold on to hope without lying to himself about the odds. Sira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Vorkai have never fought an enemy that wanted them to land. Every species they faced tried to stop them from getting close. We're doing the opposite. We're rolling out the welcome mat. And under the welcome mat is everything we have." Deo nodded slowly. He looked back at the plain. He said, "Then let them come." Somewhere beyond the moon, the Vorkai fleet began its final approach. 2 days ahead of schedule, because in 60 civilizations, nobody had ever needed the full 30 days to surrender. They had never met humans before. The Vorkai landing force touched down on day 28 and found exactly what they expected: a flat, dead, empty plain under an orange sky. Their ground sensors swept the area in the standard pattern, checking for mass troop formations, vehicle signatures, energy weapon emplacements. They found nothing. Their commanders registered this as confirmation of what their models had always predicted. The humans had chosen to abandon the site, possibly the whole region. Probably they were gathering in their cities, preparing some kind of final symbolic defense that would last a few hours before the mathematics of the situation reasserted itself. The Verkai were not careless. They were methodical. That was important to understand, because what happened next was not a result of arrogance. It was a result of a pattern so deeply embedded in their operational history that it had become invisible to them, the way a fish cannot see the water it swims in. They had done this so many times, against so many species, that their protocols had calcified into certainty. Sweep for surface threats. Find none. Begin construction operations. That was the sequence. That was always the sequence. The first construction units deployed from the landing ships were enormous machines, each one 100 meters tall, designed to begin the process of converting raw mineral ground into Vorkai infrastructure. They moved in a grid pattern, slow and systematic, beginning at the northern edge of the gray plain. Their footfalls sent tremors through the ground with each step, 3 kilometers below those footfalls. In a tunnel network that smelled of raw earth and machine oil and nervous human sweat, Lieutenant Deo Okafor sat at a sensor console and watched the vibration patterns on his screen. Beside him, a young engineer named Priya Sahani was tracking the same data and cross-referencing it with the surface grid map they had memorized over the past 2 weeks. Every tunnel had a name. Every junction had a number. Every ambush point had a trigger condition. They had rehearsed this so many times that people had started doing it in their sleep, muttering junction codes and timing sequences into their pillows. Deo watched the pattern for 90 seconds. Then he opened the command channel and said, calmly, that the northern column was in position over grid 7, right on the predicted path, 400 meters above him. Buried in the gray mineral ground at a depth the Vokai sensors could not penetrate. The first wave of shaped charges sat in their housings and waited. Sierra's voice came through the channel from the central command node 2 kilometers to the south. She said, confirm grid 7. Hold for the second unit to reach grid 12. We hit them together, or we don't hit them at all. The waiting was the hardest part. Everyone in the tunnel network knew this was the moment that would define everything that came after. If the plan worked, it would prove that the Vorkai could be hurt, that the gap in capability was not absolute, that there were ways to fight a smarter war against a stronger enemy. If it failed, there would be no second chance. The Vorkai would simply sterilize the entire plane from orbit and begin again elsewhere. On the surface, the second construction unit reached grid 12 at the 12-minute mark. Its operator, following standard Vorkai procedure, had no reason to slow down or change course. The ground was dead. The plain was empty. There was nothing here but mineral dust and the fading memory of a forest. Sierra said, now the charges went in a sequence that had been engineered to look random to any outside observer, but was, in fact, precisely calculated. The goal was not to destroy the construction units outright. They were too large and too armored for that. The goal was to do something the Vorkai had never experienced in 60 conquests. The goal was to make the ground itself become the enemy. The first series of detonations opened sinkholes beneath the front legs of both construction units simultaneously. Not explosions in the conventional sense. Not fire and shockwave, but precisely shaped collapses, engineered by mining specialists who had spent decades understanding how to make ground move in specific directions. The units lurched. Their automated stabilization systems activated immediately, pouring energy into compensating for the sudden loss of footing. That energy spike was visible from orbit, and it was the signal Syrah had been waiting for, because the stabilization systems drew power from the same grid as the sensor arrays. And for exactly 11 seconds, while those systems compensated, the sensor arrays on both units went to low-power mode dot in those 11 seconds. 60 human soldiers came up through pre-cut surface hatches across a 400-meter arc and moved fast. They were not carrying weapons designed to punch through Furkai hull plating. They were carrying tools, welding units, explosive bonding systems, and packages of a material that a chemistry team in Snow Paulo had spent 3 sleepless weeks developing. It was a compound that reacted violently with the specific alloy the Vorkai used in their cooling vents. The one weakness in their construction units that Syrah's team had identified from the footage of the first atmospheric vessel. The cooling vents were on the underside, protected from above, but exposed to the ground, because in 60 planets of conquest, nothing had ever attacked from below dot. The soldiers worked in silence, moving with the focused speed of people who had trained this specific action 400 times. They were done and back underground before the construction unit's sensors came fully back online. The hatches sealed. The gray plane looked empty again. The Vorkai operators ran diagnostics. Everything read as nominal. They logged the sinkhole event as a geological anomaly, consistent with the terrain modification their own compound had caused, and continued on their grid pattern. 40 minutes later, the cooling compound reaction reached critical temperature in both units. The first machine stopped moving and listed sideways. The second one managed 3 more steps before its drive system seized. Both units sent automated distress signals to the fleet dot in the fleet's command ship beyond the moon. This registered as the first anomaly in a conquest operation that their models suggested should be proceeding without incident. Their commanders reviewed the sensor data, found no sign of attackers, found no energy weapon signatures, found nothing but a geological event and 2 machines that had apparently suffered simultaneous mechanical failures of a type that had never occurred before in operational history. They sent a diagnostic team down Syrah, watched the diagnostic shuttle descend on the drone feeds from the surface, and felt the specific cold pleasure of a plan going exactly right. She turned to her logistics coordinator, a former civil engineer named Marcus Webb, and said, "The diagnostic team lands. They'll spend 2 hours finding nothing. They'll call it down to environment and materials interaction. And they'll recommend a sensor upgrade before the next wave deploys." Marcus said, "And while they're doing their sensor upgrade?" Sarah said, "We upgrade our tunnels." That was the part the Vorkai could not model because they had never faced it. Human adaptation speed. Not technological, not in the sense of building new weapons from scratch. Adaptive tactical thinking. The ability to look at what had just happened, identify what worked, identify what had been exposed, and change the approach before the next engagement while the enemy was still analyzing the last one. The Vorkai's operational doctrine was built on overwhelming force applied systematically, and it was brilliant against enemies who needed time and resources to adapt. Against an enemy that adapted in hours, with whatever was already at hand, the doctrine had a gap that no one had ever been around long. Enough to exploit. The diagnostic team spent 90 minutes on the surface and found a mineral composition. Anomaly they attributed to the terrain. Modification compound interacting with local geology. They filed their report. They left. The fleet commanders reviewed the report, flagged it as a low-level concern, and authorized the second deployment wave to proceed with updated sensor parameters. They had no idea that while the diagnostic team was on the surface, 3 separate tunnel crews had already begun extending the network to cover the new projected path of the second wave. They had no idea that the chemistry team had already developed a variation of the cooling compound that would be invisible to the updated sensor parameters. They had no idea that Sira had already run the second phase scenario 40 times in her head and had identified 3 different approaches depending on how the Vorkai chose to respond. Deo came to find her in the command node that evening. The light was low, and people were eating ration packs and marking maps and arguing quietly about angles and timing. He handed her a water bottle and sat down across the table. He looked tired in the way that meant he had stopped being afraid and started being focused, which she recognized as a good sign. He said, "They think we got lucky with the geology." That's what the signal analysis team decoded from their fleet comms. Sira nodded. She said, "Good. Let them keep thinking that for exactly one more engagement. After the second wave goes wrong, they'll start to look harder. That's when it gets difficult." He asked what happens when it gets difficult. She took a long drink of water and looked at the map on the table, covered in lines and numbers and small notations in 4 different languages. Then she said, "When it gets difficult, we find out what humans are actually made of. Outside, 2 kilometers up through gray mineral ground and orange-dusted sky, the Vorkai second wave." The Vorkai did not panic. That was important, and Sira had known it going in. Panic was something that happened when a situation exceeded a civilization's ability to process it emotionally. And the Vorkai had been doing this long enough that they no longer had strong emotional responses to tactical setbacks. They had something worse. They had patience and overwhelming resources. And when the second deployment wave encountered problems that matched no known geological profile, and their updated sensors still found nothing, they did not rage or rush. They stopped. They simply stopped all ground operations and held a full fleet tactical review. That review lasted 9 hours. Sira knew this because her signals intelligence team, working from a deep bunker in what had been central Brazil, had cracked enough of the Vorkai communication, encoding to read the shape of their transmissions, even when the content was still opaque. 9 hours of fleet-wide communication meant something significant was being reconsidered at the highest level. It meant the Vorkai had moved the situation from the category of anomaly to the category of problem. It also meant the window before the next move was closing. She used every minute of those 9 hours. The tunnel network now ran for nearly 4,000 kilometers beneath the gray plains and the surviving forest edges to the south and west. It had become something more than a military installation. In the weeks since the initial engagement, it had started to feel like a world of its own. A city underground, lit by portable panels, full of the noise of people working and thinking and arguing, and occasionally laughing at something dark. Because dark humor was one of the things humans did when they were scared and needed to keep moving. The engineering teams had made contact with other regional resistance nodes through fiber lines run along the tunnel floors. There were similar networks being built on 4 other continents, each one independent, each one using local terrain and local knowledge to adapt the same core strategy. A group in the Gobi had gone completely different with their approach, using the desert geography and subsurface rock formations to build a thermal interference system that made Vorkai targeting from orbit unreliable across a 300-kilometer zone. A team in northern Canada had identified that Vorkai atmospheric processors, the machines that came in the 3rd phase of their conquest to begin changing the air composition, had a single calibration frequency that, if disrupted at the right moment, caused a cascade failure in their intake systems. They had spent 2 weeks building a network of low-power transmitters to do exactly that. None of these teams were in direct communication with each other. That was deliberate. If the Vorkai cracked one node, they would find one network, one set of tactics, one piece of the picture. They would not find the whole picture because there was no central server, no single command hub, no one location where all of it was coordinated. The coordination existed in a shared doctrine that had been distributed before the communications went underground. A document, 60 pages long, that Sira and a team of strategists had written. In a 36-hour stretch during week 1, a document that said, fight with what you have where you are. Make every engagement cost them something. Never give them a clear target. And trust that everyone else is doing the same thing. The Verkai tactical review ended, and their next move was not what anyone had predicted. Instead of a third ground deployment, a single ship detached from the fleet and moved into low orbit. It began a slow, methodical scan of the gray plane. Not the broad-spectrum sweep they had used before. Something finer. Something that read not just life signs and energy signatures, but structural density variations in the soil. It was a subsurface mapper. A very good one. The kind of instrument you brought out when you suspected something was underground and needed to find it precisely before you. Acted.day. O caught the change in the orbital pattern first and brought it to Sira in 3 quick steps across the command node floor. He showed her the data on his tablet. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. Sira looked at the scan pattern for about 4 seconds. Then she said, very quietly, that they had approximately 40 minutes before the mapper completed its first pass over the northern tunnel grid. After that, the Verkai would know exactly where every tunnel was. Marcus, standing nearby, said, so we move the operation south. Sira shook her head. She said, we don't move. We give them something to find. The idea had been sitting in the back of her mind for 2 weeks, flagged as contingency, as the thing you used when the enemy stopped being confused and started being methodical. It was called, in the planning documents, the bone strategy, because the point was to give the predator a bone while the actual prey was somewhere else. Within 20 minutes. 4 tunnel sections in the northern grid were deliberately collapsed in a pattern that would look, on subsurface imaging, like a partial structure, real enough to confirm their suspicions, incomplete enough to look like work in progress, and positioned in a section that had already been cleared of personnel and had nothing of value except a specific arrangement of materials that Sira had designed very carefully. The Verkai mapper completed its pass. The fleet's tactical computers processed the data and confirmed what they had suspected. There was a human construction network underground. They had found it. Their response was immediate, calibrated, and exactly what Sira had predicted. They designated the confirmed tunnel section for precision orbital strike, a series of focused kinetic impactors that would collapse the structure without contaminating the terrain. They intended to use. The strike came 40 minutes after the mapper completed its pass. 6 impacts, perfectly placed, each one a column of force that drove down through 200 meters of soil and collapsed the tunnel sections with surgical precision. The Verkai fleet registered it as a successful elimination of a detected threat and filed it as a confirmed kill. Enemy infrastructure neutralized. Operation proceeding. They did not register the 6 signal bursts that the impacts triggered, because those bursts were not electronic. They were acoustic, coded patterns in the vibration of the ground itself, moving outward through the tunnel network at the speed of sound and soil, carrying a 3-digit code to 40 separate stations across the network. The code meant, Phase 3 is live. Phase 3 was not another ambush. Ambushes were a first-act tool. By now the Verkai were watching for them, had adjusted their sensor parameters, were performing pre-deployment sweeps at greater depth. Trying to hit their construction units again the same way would be showing them a trick they had already started defending against. Phase 3 was something different. Phase 3 was aimed not at the machines, but at the fleet's ability to understand what was happening. The Verkai relied on orbital observation to direct their ground operations. Their eyes were in space, looking down and their ground units followed the instructions those eyes provided. Take away the clarity of the orbital picture, and the ground units were slow, cautious, uncertain. They had to be, because their commanders had now learned there was something underground they could not fully see. And that meant every step of ground operation required orbital confirmation. So, Sira hit the orbital observation capacity, not the ships themselves. She had nothing that could touch ships that size. What she had were the lessons of every electronic warfare specialist, signals officer, and satellite technician who had contributed their expertise to the planning document. She had ground-based systems that could generate interference in the specific electromagnetic spectrum the Vorkai's subsurface mappers used. Not jamming, not blocking, but introducing subtle false returns. Ghost readings in the soil that looked like structural anomalies and forced the mapper to run repeat passes. Slowing its coverage rate by a factor of 6. She had teams at 17 locations across 4 continents, activating those systems simultaneously. All of them drawing power from independent generators buried at depths the Vorkai had not yet mapped. The fleet's orbital observation picture became, over the course of 4 hours, a mess of uncertain data and conflicting returns. Their tactical computers flagged large portions of the mapped area as unreliable. Their commanders, rigorous and patient, ordered a full sensor recalibration before proceeding. That recalibration would take 18 hours. Deo asked Sira what they were going to do with 18 hours. She said, sleep for 4 of them. Then redesigned the northern tunnels so that when their recalibrated sensors look down, they see exactly what we want them to see. He stared at her. He said, you can do that? She said she didn't know. She said they were going to find out. He laughed at that. It was a real laugh, not a dark one, not the kind that covered fear. It was the laugh of someone who had stopped waiting for permission to believe they could win. He went to find his bunk. Around the command node, other people who had heard the exchange started moving with a slightly different energy, a slightly straighter posture, the specific body language of people who have just been reminded that the situation, however impossible, is not yet decided. Above them, the Vorkai fleet recalibrated its instruments and prepared for what it calculated to be the final, definitive phase of the operation. In their entire history, no enemy had survived to this stage of contact. Their models projected that whatever resistance remained was fragmenty. The moment the Vorkai recalibrated their sensors and looked down again, they saw a tunnel network. It was extensive, clearly mapped, and positioned exactly where their updated models predicted a surviving resistance force would concentrate. Their commanders reviewed the data, confirmed the target coordinates, and ordered the most thorough orbital strike package they had used since a particularly stubborn silicon-based civilization 40 years ago had tried to use their planet's cave systems as a refuge. The Vorkai did not make the mistake of being incremental this time. They committed. 47 precision impactors, staged in 3 sequential waves, designed to collapse every structure their sensors had identified to a depth of 500 meters. Every single one of them hit empty tunnels. The network they had mapped was real. The construction was real. The structural signatures were real. What was not real was the suggestion that anyone was inside it. Sira's teams had spent 18 hours turning the northern grid into an elaborate decoy, filling it with the acoustic and thermal signatures of active occupation, using nothing more sophisticated than portable heaters, vibration generators, and the same mining equipment they had used to dig the tunnels in the first place. The actual population of the network had moved south, east and deeper, into sections dug in the weeks prior, sections that had been kept completely cold, silent, and still invisible to everything the key. Vorkai's updated sensors were calibrated to detect. The orbital strike consumed a significant fraction of the fleet's precision. Munitions reserve. Not enough to leave them depleted, but enough to be logged as a material expenditure in their operational accounting. The Vorkai reviewed the post-strike sensor data, confirmed structural collapse across all target zones, and marked the ground resistance as neutralized. 6 hours later, they began their third ground deployment. The construction units moved in at the southern edge of the gray plain, where the dead mineral ground met the surviving tree line. Their sensors showed nothing. Their subsurface mappers, recalibrated and now operating at maximum sensitivity, showed clean soil with no structural anomalies. Their commanders authorized full operation speed. The units moved fast, the way they had moved in 60 previous conquests when the hard part was over, and only the work remained. The first thing that went wrong was small. One of the atmospheric processors, a forward unit sent ahead of the construction column to begin the air composition work, simply stopped. No explosion, no dramatic failure. It stopped, ran a diagnostic cycle, and reported a calibration error in its intake system. The operator cued a remote reset. The processor reset, ran for 4 minutes, and stopped again. A second unit 2 kilometers away did the same thing 11 minutes later, in the fleet command ship. This was flagged as a possible environmental interference issue. It was noted and monitored. It was not yet treated as a threat. On the ground, at a depth of 80 meters beneath the tree line's edge, a young engineer from the Canadian network who had traveled south 3 weeks ago to integrate the transmitter system was watching a frequency monitor and counting quietly. She had calibrated the system to cycle the intake disruption at irregular intervals, because regular intervals would eventually be recognized as intentional. Irregular ones looked like environmental noise for longer. Her name was Tomoko Reis. She was 26. She had not seen sunlight in 3 weeks, and she was methodically ending the Vorkai's ability to process Earth's atmosphere at the rate they needed to make the planet useful, because that was the thing about the Vorkai's plan that had taken Sierra's team the longest to fully understand. And once they understood it, it changed everything about how they fought. The Vorkai were not here to destroy Earth. Destruction was wasteful. They were here to convert it, to run it through their atmospheric processors and construction systems, and turn it into something they could use. That process required a very specific atmospheric composition, and achieving that composition from Earth's current state required the processors to run continuously for approximately 4 months. Without the processors running, the timeline extended by a factor of 10, and a 40-month occupation of a contested planet was not operationally sustainable for a fleet that had other destinations scheduled. The Vorkai needed Earth to cooperate with its own conversion, at least atmospherically, and Tomoko's transmitters were making that cooperation impossible. By the end of the second day of the third deployment, 11 of the 16 atmospheric processors were cycling between failure and reset. The fleet's operational commanders ran the timeline projections and did not like what they found. They brought in their technical specialists, who determined that the intake failures were caused by an external signal in a very specific frequency band, and who then spent 8 hours trying to locate the source of that signal. They found 17 transmitter locations, because those were the ones Sierra had intended them to find. The other 29 were in locations so deep and so carefully shielded that the Vorkai's instruments read them as geological background noise. Fleet ordered targeted strikes on the 17 identified transmitters. The strikes were successful. The 17 transmitters went offline. 3 of the atmospheric processors recovered and resumed operation. 8 remained in failure cycles, because 8 of the 29 undetected transmitters were positioned directly beneath the processor units themselves, in tunnels that had been dug before the Vorkai's recalibrated sensors were fully deployed, and which had been built with a particular kind of layered shielding that a geologist named Dr. Amara Osei had. developed in week 2 based on the mineral composition of the very gray dust the Verkai had created when they destroyed the forest. The dust, it turned out, had specific electromagnetic properties when compressed and layered in alternating sheets, properties that the Verkai had created themselves and never thought to account for in their sensor. Calibration. They had built their own blind spot and handed it to the people they were trying to conquer. Fleet tactical review that followed was the longest yet. 22 hours. When it ended, the Verkai commanders did something they had not done in 61 conquests. They sent a communication to the human command structure, which they had now correctly identified as distributed and decentralized, but had traced to a sufficient number of nodes to establish contact. The communication was formal, structured, and came in every human language, the same way the first message had. It said, "We acknowledge an asymmetric resistance capability that our models did not account for. We propose a cessation of current operations to discuss terms." Sira read the message in the command node with Marcus and Deo standing beside her. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly, the way you read something when you need to be sure you are not misunderstanding it because you want it to say what you think it says. She looked at Marcus. She asked if he was reading what she was reading. He said yes. He said they were asking to talk. Deo said very carefully that talking was not the same as leaving. Sierra said, "No, it's not. But it means they've updated their model. It means we're no longer a minor variable they're managing around. We're a factor they have to account for. That's different. That is genuinely different." She drafted the human response herself over the next 2 hours, with input from 12 nodes across the global network and from Admiral Chun, who was still alive and operating from an underground facility in what had been eastern China. The response was measured and direct. It said that humanity would discuss terms under one condition, which was that all Verkai ground operations ceased immediately and verifiably, that the atmospheric processors were shut down, and that the fleet moved to a position beyond the orbit of Mars for the duration of any negotiation. It said that humanity was not interested in terms that involved any form of conversion or occupation. It said that humanity was prepared to continue the current operational tempo indefinitely, and that the current operational tempo, in the assessment of humanity's strategic command, would make any Verkai timeline for conversion of the planet unworkable. It did not threaten. It did not boast. It stated facts. The fleet took 6 hours to respond. Then they moved to beyond Mars. The negotiation that followed lasted 4 months, and at no point was it easy. The Verkai were not accustomed to being on the losing side of a resource calculation, and discovering that a species they had, written off as primitive, had made their operation more expensive than it was worth, was an adjustment that their representatives made visibly and with considerable difficulty. But they made it because the Verkai were, at their core, rational. The math had changed. 61 civilizations had been converted. This one had made conversion cost more than it was worth. Their fleet had other schedules. Their resources were not unlimited. On the day the agreement was signed, Sierra was standing at the edge of the gray plain again. The atmospheric processors had been shut down and removed. The construction units had been taken back to the fleet. The sky was still orange some days from the dust, but it was getting clearer. Biologists who had been underground for months were already beginning to talk about reclamation strategies, about the specific organisms that could begin breaking down the gray mineral layer and rebuilding soil chemistry from nothing. T.